Hello, my name is Lisa Verwise, and I'm the Registrar and Collections Manager for Cultural History at Museum of the Rockies. And today I get to present to you Brews and the Big Sky, the Lunatic Fringe, Montana in the 19th Amendment. This is a little bit different than our normal Brews and the Big Sky format. Normally, this is our opportunity to get together, have some great beer from a local Montana brewery, and learn about a topic in Montana history. But times are a little bit strange, so now we're going to do this from the comfort of our own homes. So I invite you to go ahead and grab your favorite alcoholic or non-alcoholic beverage, kick back, make yourself comfortable, and get excited to learn about the fight for women's suffrage in Montana and in the United States. Thanks for joining me today. In order to really take a comprehensive look at women's suffrage, we would have to go all the way back to the Revolutionary War and have much more than 25 minutes. So instead, we're going to actually start in the 1890s and move forward from there. And I chose the 1890s for a few different reasons. As you see from the map as it's clicking through here, by the time 1890 rolls around, we actually see quite a few different suffrage campaigns, as well as successes and losses. And in 1890, two of the major women's suffrage organizations on the national level have decided to merge, and they create the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And this is the point when they decide that they're going to stop focusing on a constitutional amendment, and instead they're going to start focusing their efforts on state-by-state enfranchisement, which is a much slower way to gain women the right to vote, but they did this for a couple reasons. One of those reasons is that they could really focus their resources on states that seemed more amenable towards granting women's suffrage. And the other thought was that if enough states granted women's suffrage, then a constitutional amendment would just naturally follow. So one of those states that did end up granting women full voting rights before the 19th Amendment was Montana. And so it's this really great microcosm to look at the women's suffrage fight through. So we can take a look at what the arguments were, how long it was taking, and who these people were on the ground trying to get suffrage passed. There are a couple things that you should know about Montana before we jump right into it. And that's that Montana became a state in 1889. And when Montana became a state, it did allow women the right to vote in school elections, and it also gave them the right to vote on matters that had to do with taxpayers, as long as they were taxpayers themselves. So while it sounds like they're giving women some voting rights, they're actually really quite limited. It's also important to note that some lawmakers did actually try to give women full enfranchisement when Montana became a state in 1890, but it was seen as very controversial, and they were worried that it would jeopardize Montana's ability to become a state. And so they ended up not enshrining that right in the state constitution. But legislators are still thinking about this, and we actually do see women's suffrage come up in nearly every single legislative session from 1893 to 1911. Although the state legislature clearly continued debating women's suffrage, it took 25 years from the time Montana became a state until the women of the state were fully enfranchised. And so this gave suffragists 25 years to come up with a strong message to convince people to vote for women's suffrage, and also gave them a long time to create a strong network that would help advance their cause. Because of course the state-by-state method that the national organization was pushing wouldn't work unless you had passionate people on the ground who were organized and who could convince their friends and neighbors and communities that they needed to vote for suffrage as well. So some of the arguments that Montana suffragists ended up making in favor of suffrage were primarily moral ones. So despite the fact that this might not be what every suffragist believed, many of the arguments that we see in Montana for suffrage fall somewhere along the morality spectrum. And by that I mean that essentially suffragists were arguing that men and women were very different, that women were more gentle, they were more humane, and that they would essentially make society better if they could have the vote. And so some of the arguments that we see are that women would increase the quality of life for children if they were given the right to vote. We see that argument that women would improve working class conditions if they were allowed to vote because they would vote in favor of humane legislation dealing with working conditions or minimum wages or a standard work week, working hours. So this is a really large argument that we see in Montana in favor of suffrage, but it's not the only one that we see. Some of the less savory arguments that we see is that we do see suffragists playing on racial tension, racism, and xenophobia, and so we do see arguments in Montana and in other states that women should be given the right to vote because they will help cancel out the votes of newly arrived immigrants. That's especially important to some people in Montana, as Montana is really having a large influx of immigrants at this time. We also see the argument that white women's votes specifically are needed to cancel out the votes of black men. And so although the suffrage cause is a positive one, there are a lot of negative arguments being made in favor of it. And we actually know that a lot of suffragists later regretted making those arguments. We see some recanting of that, but it's still important to remember that suffragists and the cause were certainly not above trading in on racism and xenophobia at the time. Some of the other more positive arguments that are being made are your standard arguments that women are equal to men, voting is a right that should be granted to all Americans, and that if women are expected to obey laws, they should be able to have some say in the creation of those laws. So those are some of the major arguments that we see. But of course, if you have a message, you need messengers to get it out there, to get it to the public, to your community, to your friends and neighbors. And so I really want to put a personal face on some of these suffragists that are carrying this message out to their communities. I bet you thought that I was going to start out by telling you about Jeannette Rankin, and I tricked you. We're actually going to start out with Ella Knowles Haskell, who came before Jeannette Rankin on the suffrage scene in Montana. And Ella has a really interesting story. She actually moved here in 1888 for the dry air after she survived tuberculosis. And when she moved here, she was a lawyer, but women could not practice law in Montana at that time. And so one of the first things that Ella did upon moving to the state was get that law changed, and in 1889 she became the first woman licensed to practice law in the state. So right away, as soon as Ella gets to Helena, she is already breaking down barriers for women and helping to advance equal rights for women. Just a few years later, she actually also ran for state attorney general, which was a race she did not win, but she did travel around the state campaigning, and she earned herself the nickname the Silver-Tongued Orator of Montana. So she was really known for this speaking style, clear and eloquent, and she would go on to use those skills to help advocate for suffrage in the state. Because as women's suffrage organizations were starting to form, Ella Haskell was right there taking part in those organizations, including the Montana Women's Suffrage Association, which formed in the mid-1890s. She was one of their first presidents, and just a year after taking the presidency, she not only organized a suffrage petition drive, but she actually did speak to the state legislature in favor of women's suffrage, and that was one of many disappointments at the state legislature level, as it clearly did not pass. But Ella did spend the rest of her life continuing to advocate for women's rights and for women's suffrage. She unfortunately passed away in 1911, so Ella never got to see suffrage come to light. Alongside Ella Knowles as one of the original champions for suffrage for Montanans was Mary Long Alderson of Bozeman. And Mary Alderson started advocating for suffrage back in 1893 after she heard Susan B. Anthony speak in Chicago. After that trip, Mary came back to Bozeman, and she ended up joining the Bozeman chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU. And you may have guessed from their name that their primary goal was not necessarily suffrage, but prohibition. Although the WCTU, which was a national organization, felt that if women got the right to vote, that they would vote in prohibition and that society would be better without alcohol. So again, there we see this morality argument taking shape and starting to enter the suffrage world. Mary actually became really important in the state as a suffrage organizer, and she actually headed up the suffrage campaign for the WCTU, and she worked on this issue from 1893 until it passed in 1914, so she was in it for the long haul. And by the time everything was said and done, Mary had traveled thousands of miles and organized thousands of organization members to try to get suffrage passed. And so this is why it's so important to have people in the state advocating for suffrage, because she was able to really get a neighbor-to-neighbor campaign going. And so getting people to speak to their friends, their relatives, their community members, and to really spread this network out throughout the entire state. And Mary doesn't often get spoken about when we speak about women's suffrage in the state of Montana, and part of that is her affiliation with the WCTU. So even though the WCTU had a long history of encouraging women's suffrage, it was actually generally shunned by other suffrage organizations on the national, the state, and the local level. And so Mary and her organization were often not welcomed by other suffragists in the state, and that's because the alcohol lobby was really, really strong. And so other suffragists were pretty concerned that if they had prohibition wrapped up in women's suffrage, that the alcohol industry would lobby so hard against it that suffrage would fail. And so even within the suffrage movement, we do see these rifts, we do see division and disagreement about what the best way to go about gaining women's suffrage is, and not every organization liked working with each other. Speaking about this division, Mary actually does have this really great quote, part of which you see there on the screen. She's speaking about one of the other state suffrage leaders saying, "Its leader told me not to dare to bring prohibition into the campaign. I was not taking orders." Although we have women like Ella Knowles Haskell and Mary Long Alderson working on women's suffrage for decades, we're really not seeing a whole lot of traction, at least at the state legislature level, which is really important because suffrage needs to pass the legislature in order to go before a public vote. And so we see almost 2 full decades of suffrage advocacy before there's a turning point. And that turning point is Jeannette Rankin. So Jeannette is from Missoula, and she has left the state in order to go work on suffrage campaigns in other places. So she's worked in New York, and she's most recently been in the state of Washington, and she had been working on their successful suffrage campaign, which had passed just 1 year before in 1910. And so Jeannette came to back to Montana in 1911, and she speaks before the state legislature in favor of women's suffrage. And once again, that does not pass the state in 1911. And so Jeannette, though, she's brought with her all of this organizing know-how, all of these successful strategies, and so she decides that she and other suffrage leaders need to create a much more cohesive network in the state, and that they also really need to focus their efforts on the state legislature itself, because that's where the issue keeps getting held up. And so in 1912 and 1913, Jeannette and other suffragists in the state work really hard to get women's suffrage on the platform of all of the major political parties in the state of Montana. Also, when they meet a legislator that does not support women's suffrage, they actively lobby against that individual. And so we really do start to see the tide turning from 1912 to 1913. And by the time the legislature meets again in 1913, women's suffrage is on the platform for all of the parties that are meeting, and so we do see women's suffrage pass the legislature in 1913, which means it's headed for a popular vote in 1914, and that means that the suffragists really need to get to work organizing out in the communities and throughout the state. So once this measure has passed the state legislature, that's when we really start to see this full court press public campaign to try to get the public to pass women's suffrage in 1914. One of the mouthpieces of this public relations campaign was Mary ONeill from Butte, and Mary had been involved in the suffrage movement for several years. She actually had spoken to the 1905 legislature in favor of women's suffrage, which was yet another defeat for the movement, but she was also a newspaper woman, and she had written in favor of equal suffrage for women as well as other equal rights for women. And so she was a really natural pick to be the head of the public relations for this massive campaign that Jeannette Rankin was organizing. And one of the several things that Mary ONeill did was to found and write for the Suffrage Daily News, which was published from September to November of election year and was a really great propaganda piece for the suffrage movement. She also was known for organizing parades. She organized one major parade in Helena that attracted thousands of people, and she also helped other suffragists hone their message that they would take out to their communities and to the public. And this is where, again, we see this morality argument come into play. And so a piece of advice that Mary gave that was printed in the Billings Gazette is give them all the dope you can about the influence of women on behalf of children and appeal to the higher standard of motherhood. That's the gush that gets the public. So again, we see this push for women as higher moral creatures that are going to make society better and make things better for our children. So this continued push for the morality argument. One of the women taking this message out into their community was Maggie Smith Hathway. And Maggie was originally an educator from Ravalli County. From 1913 to 1914, she traveled nearly 6,000 miles throughout the state, speaking to different communities all along the way. Sometimes she would give multiple speeches in 1 week. And all of this travel and the number of speeches she gave actually earned her the nickname the Whirlwind. Educators played actually a really important role in the suffrage movement. For one thing, some suffragists were going into the schools to speak to students, everything from elementary school students all the way up through high school. And they were speaking about how great suffrage was and also asking students to go home and tell their fathers to vote in favor of women's suffrage. Educators were also important in this struggle because they were already fighting for equal rights for women. Educators throughout the state had already been battling for equal pay to their male counterparts, so they were already well versed in how to sway public opinion in order to gain equal rights. You actually see a flyer here on your screen, and that is a leaflet that was produced by the Missoula Teachers Suffrage Committee, and they distributed over 30,000 of this one leaflet alone about why women teachers should have the right to vote. And they lay out lots of different arguments, but I want to specifically point out the one that once again recalls that morality argument. You can see it in the middle of the leaflet here. It says, essentially, teachers are in a sense municipal mothers and have that altruistic sense of motherhood, which when freed will be a potent force for human betterment. So again, we still keep seeing this argument over and over again, that if we just allow women to vote, their mothering instincts will come out and they'll help guide society to a better place. And last but not least for today is Belle Fleigelman from Helena. And I really like Belle's story. She might be my current favorite suffragist. And I like Belle because she left Montana, she went to school in Wisconsin, came back to Helena in 1914 and started writing for newspapers. And then she ended up working with the suffragist community and the movement, giving speeches on street corners and throughout the state. And what I really appreciate about her is that she wrote a lot of her experiences and memories down and published them. And so we really get a sense of what it took for a woman to go stand on a street corner in a random city and just start talking to the community and hoping that people would stop and listen to her, and how unusual that really was for the time. I particularly wanted to share Belle's memory of her first speech that she ever gave on a street corner in Helena, and I love this story because what she says is, "My mother was horrified. Well, it was all right for women to vote," she said. "No respectable lady would speak on a street corner. She warned me that if I made one more speech on the street, I needn't come home. That night, I slept in a hotel and charged it to my father." So I just really like Belle's level of sass and her devotion to the cause and her ability to get out of her comfort zone and really work towards something that she believed in. And she also gives us a lot of reminiscences of what it was like to go into other small towns with other suffragists. And one of her other stories that I liked, she's speaking about going with suffragist Lucille Topping to Marysville, which is outside of Helena. And she says, "We went to Marysville, a little gold mining town. We arrived in the evening and gave our talk in the miners' hall. All the miners came in their high rubber boots, listening attentively to what we had to say. When we were finished, someone got out a fiddle and we danced. And while we pushed these men in their rubber boots around the dance floor, we thanked them earnestly for the votes they were going to give us in November. I think we won Marysville." So Belle leaves us with these really great stories of what it was like to work on this campaign and the types of measures that women were going to, even if they weren't considered normal by society, to make sure that they were able to get the right to vote. She also was a newspaper woman, and she helped write the Suffrage Daily News as well. So we see all of these women pushing from 1913 to 1914 all across the state, and there are thousands of women. I just picked a few, but there are thousands of women doing the same things in their communities, and they're talking to schools, and they're talking to labor unions, and they're talking to miners and loggers and farming organizations, and they're adapting their messages to fit those communities and to do everything they can to get women's suffrage passed, because again, it's all men voting on women's suffrage, and so you have to go to where the votes are and give them the message that will most make them likely to champion your cause as well. In 1914, Montana passes full suffrage for women 53% to 47%. And you can see on the map here which counties voted for suffrage in yellow or against in white. And these are also county lines as they existed in 1914. So this makes Montana the 11th state in the Union to pass full suffrage for women, and all of those states are actually west of the Mississippi. There are still hurdles to overcome in Montana, which has just received full suffrage for women. And so Jeannette Rankin at this time decides that she's going to run for Congress for the House of Representatives in 1916. And she decides to do this, according to Belle Fleigelman, who served as one of her campaign managers. She decides to do this because she thinks that it's not enough to give women the right to vote, that they need to be inspired to use that right. And so she decides to run for Congress. And she wins. So Montana elects the first woman in the country to Congress, to the House of Representatives. And at the same time, although they're often overshadowed by Jeannette's accomplishment, Montana also elects 2 women to its state legislature. And one of those women is the Whirlwind, Mrs. Maggie Smith Hathaway, and the other one is Emma Ingalls, who was also a prominent suffragist out of the Flathead Valley area. Emma had also been a homesteader as well as a newspaper founder, and she was well known for pushing for equal rights through newspaper editorials. So we have lots of barriers being broken in Montana at this time when women are given the right to vote. By the time Jeannette takes office in 1917, the national focus has shifted away from the state-by-state approach and back towards a constitutional amendment, because the state-by-state approach is taking much too long. If you remember, the suffragists have been at this since at least 1890 on a state-by-state approach. And so by the time Jeannette gets to Washington, we're seeing a pretty dramatic increase in the amount of protests that are happening in our nation's capital, as well as the intensity of those protests. And Jeannette is not the only Montanan to make the trip to Washington, D.C. Hazel Hornins of Billings has also found herself there, but she is not there as part of Congress. She is there on the front lines. So you see Jeannette here on the left, and you see Hazel on the right on the picket lines. And Hazel protests in Washington, D.C. for 2 years, from 1917 to 1919. During that time, she is a part of many of the major protests in the city, and she's actually arrested a minimum of 3 times, mostly for disorderly conduct, but also for obstruction of traffic. She also chained herself to the front gate of the White House, so if you don't have a favorite suffragist yet, Hazel might be your gal. Even though suffrage had passed in Montana, I think it's really interesting that the Montana newspapers did not have positive things to say about Hazel. So at the same time that they're celebrating sending Jeannette to Congress, they're also, when they pay her any attention at all, they're actually pretty derogatory towards Hazel. So the Helena Independent actually said that Hazel is a part of the lunatic fringe, which hangs forever around the edge of the suffrage cause. And luckily, Hazel does not listen to the newspapers or to the people that tell her that she just needs to go home and marry a nice hometown boy. And she and thousands of other women like her continue to protest, continue to put pressure on the government, and continue to help turn the public tide of opinion towards supporting women's suffrage. Of course, in addition to the protesters and the pressure they're putting on the government from the outside, luckily now they do have a woman on the inside. Jeannette Rankin is there in the House of Representatives, and she is still working to get suffrage to the forefront and working as well for that constitutional amendment. And so one of the earliest things she does in her term is to recommend and then be appointed to the Committee on Women's Suffrage in 1917, and by 1918, Jeannette actually does open debate in the House of Representatives on a constitutional amendment granting suffrage to women. Unfortunately, that amendment passes the House, but it fails in the Senate by 2 votes. And by the time it comes back before the Senate again in 1919, Jeannette is no longer a member of Congress because she did not win her election bid to the Senate for that term. So unfortunately, while she did get to cast her vote in favor of women gaining the right to vote, she wasn't there for the eventual passage of the 19th Amendment, which happened in June of 1919. But like all constitutional amendments, it did have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And so suffragists are still working on a state-by-state basis and putting pressure on those individual state governments as well. The 19th Amendment gets its last required state ratification in August of 1920, and it becomes law specifically on August 26, and it states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." And this is really exciting. This is cause for celebration. It is the centennial this year, but it is also important to remember who the 19th Amendment leaves out. We often talk about the 19th Amendment as a watershed for women's rights and women's voting rights, but it actually doesn't include all women in the United States. And so I want to take just a minute to note who is left out of this amendment. Because the 19th Amendment gives U.S. citizens the right to vote, at this time that primarily means white women and African American women. Because of previous racist policies and laws, many Native Americans are not able to gain citizenship, and also many Asian Americans, or most Asian American immigrants, are also not eligible to apply for citizenship either. We don't actually see full citizenship and voting rights for Native Americans until 1948, and we don't see full citizenship and voting rights for Asian Americans until 1952. It's also important to remember that just because you have the legal right to vote doesn't mean that you can practically exercise that right. And we know that discriminatory practices kept many, many African Americans from exercising their right to vote for decades. And some of those discriminatory practices were things like literacy tests and poll taxes and intimidation and physical violence. So while it is very important to celebrate the passage of the 19th Amendment and all of the men and women who were so dedicated to the cause for so many years, it's also important to remember that there was, and there still is, a long road to enfranchisement for many people in the United States. That was a lot of information, and we barely even scratched the surface of the history of women's suffrage in the United States. But I will leave you with this. For many of us, suffrage was not always a right in the United States, and it's only thanks to the prolonged, dedicated efforts of people like Mary Alderson, Hazel Hornins, Jeannette Rankin, and thousands more like them that led to suffrage in 1920. Their dedication and their persistence really helped to move that needle of social change and women's rights and equality in substantial ways. So I would encourage you, the next time you cast your ballot in this, the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, to use it as a celebration for the people that came before you and helped enshrine your right to have your voice heard. Thanks again for joining me.